thinking about a very important moment in my formation, my faith formation. I have to begin with the joke that I've shared with some of you. I have never participated in one of your weekends. So it's not like I signed up for this because I thought it was that and found out I was supposed to talk. And when I was first approached to be a part of this, and I'm just a part of this time here at BTS, when any human is really in charge, even of a talk, we've lost our way. We've lost our way. We're all followers. So when I was asked to come and follow Christ with you, my wife is the vice president here at the seminary, and is also a professor, we've been married for the longest time, but she made a Cursillo weekend in the late 80s. She's worked for the church for decades. And she knows me as sort of a heady Thomist. And Thomist means I have a picture on my desk of Harry Potter and Thomas Aquinas, is what that means. Let's put it this way, I'm sort of a head person. And all my graduate work and formation is mostly Jesuit and mostly what's called systematic theology. And my wife sort of laughed and she said, I can't even see you having coffee with someone in Cursillo. And it wasn't an insult to you, it was an insult to me, sort of. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, I don't know, they believe that they have bodies. And they have an undisciplined curiosity for who God is. And they have a disruptive hope in the real presence of Christ. Now, I was raised Catholic and didn't become an Episcopalian until my 30s, and worked for the Catholic Church and for a cardinal. And so the word real presence, if you're a Catholic, is a very specific thing. It's a reference to the way we encounter Christ in the bread and wine. So her even saying that you have a sort of disruptive hope in meeting the real presence of Christ, I know what she was saying, which is that you see altars everywhere. And you make offerings everywhere. And you elevate the elements of the earth. My wife looked at me and she said, so you're really going to go hang out with the universal priesthood? I was like, of course I am, because I'm sort of competitive like that. I was like, yeah, I can do that. She said, well, I know it'll work because they are good people. So I don't know whether or not this is a vocation to spend time with you or a penance for the idolatry of what my wife calls head Christianity. And of course I then launched into a whole thing like, so it's all just, feel and not Cursillo, just the Christian life. So it's just feelings, and who's going to go to the floor of the UN and make an argument on natural law to get us the documents we believe? And what about objective truth? And, can you take that, to a conference on nuclear weapons? Can you take that into the Geneva Conventions? I feel this, you feel that. And she just looked at me and she just smiled and she said, man, you really need to hang out with these folks. She said, I said they had bodies, not decapitated bodies. They are the mind plus. They believe that God gave us the whole body, that the whole body needs conversion. Conversion, this is a word that makes people uncomfortable. And Satan loves that it makes people uncomfortable. Because conversion is uncomfortable. So I just want to begin that. Please don't be under any illusion that some kind of expert on who you are in this movement is speaking to you. What my field is of research is how faith grows. And as I shared yesterday with some of your leaders, one of the things we do here at the seminary is we apply for large grants from things like the Lilly Foundation or the John Templeton Foundation. And I've been a part of about 5 grants over the last 10 years. The first one was on confirmation. We got like a $2 million grant to study confirmation, best practices across the country. The Lilly Foundation is an ecumenical group, by the way, so this isn't just Episcopalians. Then we had a grant on baptism, baptismal ministry, the ministry of laity. We just recently got one for families, like how to, if you have a church school attached to your church, what are the best practices around the country of churches that are helping their families who come to them for the school encounter God. Just last night we received another $2 million grant for compelling preaching. And the reason I share that with you is it is literally my job to look at the country and find what's working. And when you meet a leader in something that's working, how did we get that? It's like looking at a great athlete and say, how did we get a Simone Biles? What did she eat? Who were her coaches? What prayers did she say? That's like literally my job. And I have to tell you, it gets a little boring when every time you find a leader in the Episcopal Church who hasn't given in to skepticism, who is aware but not distracted by the narrative of decline, who is stubbornly successful. As I write down, I do interviews, I do podcasts and stuff like that, and at some point, every now and then someone says, where all this started? And I'm like, well, there was this Cursillo weekend. I'm like, oh, here we go. It's not the only, but it is one of the recurring experiences in the lives of people who have changed the life of the Episcopal Church. Also camp experiences, like 5th grade, we're way back. People's journey with Christ either intensified or it began. So I'm here because there's that great line, if you've ever heard it, Mark Twain was once asked, do you believe in infant baptism? And he was a bit of a cynic, and he said, of course I do. I've seen it. So there are a lot of people who believe in the efficacy of Cursillo ministry, really believe in their heart, because they've had an experience or they love someone who's had an experience. I believe in the efficacy of Cursillo ministry because I've seen it. I could be a stone-cold atheist. And as a researcher, there is something about the experiences that you've had and that you've given yourself over to be a vessel that someone else might have not the same experience. That's the beauty of it. That's conformity. Look at how many kinds of butterflies there are in the world. God doesn't call us in a community for conformity, but that you believe that the Holy Spirit meets people in this experience. And I can only say, as someone who has never set out to study what we do, that when I study where there's life in the church, in families, in relationships, it's a word that keeps coming up. In fact, I can't believe it's taken this long in my life to actually pursue a deeper understanding of who you are. So to say it the way normal people would say it, it's working. It's working the way God works, though. My wife and I purchased a farm, a 150-acre farm in New Jersey last year because we want to build a retreat center and like an education center where people can come and learn about food and the earth. Half the property is woods, so it's just trails. So I'm going to set up the Stations of the Cross. You know, that's my Catholic thing. But anyway, on a very practical level, we have to redo some of the bathrooms. And I was told something by a contractor that those of you in ministry might laugh at if you have never heard it before. You've heard a contractor tell you, you can have good, fast, and cheap. That's what everybody wants. You can only have 2 of the 3 at a time. So go for a walk and make your decision. So I actually thought it out, and I thought, it's actually true. You can have good, and you can have cheap. But if you have good and cheap, it's not going to be fast. You can have fast and good, but it's not going to be cheap. And this poor guy didn't realize he's like giving me that because he's become like a theological principle for me about faith formation. And when we say cheap, translate that into how much of your life you have to pay, like how much time, how much energy. And the truth about formation is it's exactly right about those three things. Something that's cheap doesn't take a lot of time. It may not be good or fast, but it could be one of those two. But it won't be good and fast if it didn't really cost you that much of your time. You could have a faith experience that's really good. And it could be fast, but for it to be really good, it's never going to be cheap in terms of time. Remember, Jesus spent 3 years just building relationships with people on a journey. He spent 30 years building relationships with family and local people, who of course would be the first to not accept the prophet in their hometown, but he still spent 30 years on them, being invited to a different view of him. So what I love about your ministry is you have, because you're willing to not look for something cheap, that is to say something that doesn't take much, you have things that are good, and in many ways, in the course of 3 days, are fast in a good way. You're not inviting someone to a parish and hope that over the course of a year they might have a meaningful conversation at coffee hour. You trust God, that God can work in hours to change lives. It's not the only way God works, but you've picked up this ministry. And I can just tell you that you can't study things that are working in the Episcopal Church and not eventually come across your movement. So I'm a fan, not an expert. The thought I had before I outline a little bit of what we're going to talk about this morning and this afternoon is, again, I was raised Catholic, very Catholic. My mother was raised by nuns. She was an orphan, and my father grew up in a very poor and abusive household, and the church was also kind of the only sustaining. So I was raised, that, especially with my mom's case, that all nuns were my grandmother. Because the mother church was literally that when you're an orphan. So to this day, I have a great love of the Catholic Church, and it's really the only theology I've ever formally studied. But I was working for the Cardinal in Boston in the late 1990s. I don't know if any of you can figure out that timeline. And I was one of the people working on speeches and things like that. And so I spent about a month with other Jesuits trying to defend the Cardinal against the Boston Globe until we all realized the Globe was right. And as the Catholic Church collapsed, not God's church, but the Catholic Church collapsed in Boston because of the scandals, I moved to Virginia and decided to start in a new denomination. And sort of right on the shores of Alexandria to another seminary to start my theological education over again. What I love about the Episcopal Church is I really didn't have to start it over again. I just had to take the word Pope out of all the sentences, and it's actually very similar. I didn't leave the Catholic Church because of the scandal. If you've studied history, you never join if you have a problem with scandal. I left the Catholic Church because the scandal showed me the imagination of that denomination for the full participation of all people in the work of the church was just too small. Because when things were so horrible and the church was in crisis, I was always sitting outside the room. Women couldn't even go into the rooms where the decisions were being made. Lots of people couldn't go into the rooms. And it just occurred to me that their particular view of what it means to be a layperson even just isn't as expansive as God has for us in baptism. So I didn't leave the church angry. I mean, I'm appalled by what happened, but I left the church because I just feel God has so much more for every baptized person than that particular denomination offers. And the Episcopal Church tries very hard to baptize, ordain, marry, bless everyone, every kind of person. We haven't done it well, but it's at least a project. And there are other denominations that aren't even engaged in that project. So I'd rather be in a project that has good days and bad days than as I was for so many years in a denomination that doesn't value that as a holy project at all. But I must say that my parents are very involved in something, some of you might have heard of it, called Marriage Encounter. right? Huge Catholic movement in the late 60s, early 70s, part of the Vatican II. There was a little window there where the church's expanded view of lay ministry, and then the church sort of then had an overreaction, right, to the change. But there was a little window in there with the music was guitars and churches where the architecture was changed and an altar was put among the people, and one of them was this flourishing of this ministry called Marriage Encounter, which is lay-led, very similar to Crucio. And they had weekends where you could go on trips with other people who were in the program. And it was more sort of a weekly, monthly meeting in that way. But it was just all lay people. And my parents, who really had no formal education, this was life-changing for them. To be trusted with leading prayers, and leading Lectio Divina and things like that happened. And that I can tell you, having worked for the church was always very skeptical of Marriage Encounter. These people were teaching the Bible to each other. You know, they were going on camping weekends and having their own liturgies. And they were. Turns out some of the priests actually loved it too. But the memory that struck me this morning as we opened in prayer for your dear sister's mother, I remember that my older sister had graduated from high school, and I was 8 and my brother was 10, so she was older than us. And a big partier, wasn't really getting along with my parents. You probably know some teenagers like that. They were all too much alike, frankly. My father was a pretty serious alcoholic, and as was my sister already in high school, so they just sort of clashed. And we went away on a Marriage Encounter weekend, which was a family camping trip. Kids weren't always allowed, right? Because Marriage Encounter is about the couples. And you write letters to each other and to God and all this stuff. But once or twice a year that you're allowed to bring your kids. So we all went camping. My parents had a huge fight with my sister, who had, as they graduated from college, she was graduated from high school, was still living at home. She didn't want to go. She hated church. She hated them. Fight. And Sunday morning, we were at the Poconos, and we woke up, and we were going to have like a Eucharist. A priest drove to the Eucharist. It was right out, it's all the campers, and he had one of those pop-ups, you know, top goes up, sides go out, and other people had tents, and we're all kind of in a circle. It was maybe 10 couples, my parents' best friends. And we were getting ready, and my brother and I had wandered off. My parents didn't know where we were, and you know how when parents get scared is when they yell at you. So they put us brought us back in the camper. Everyone else was getting ready for church, and we were about to get screamed at. And part of me was like, Dad, I think, you know, church is, he was like, God can wait. He'd been a sergeant in the Marine Corps in the Korean War, so I thought this is not going to go well. So someone knocked on the door, his best friend, and said, you know, Ed, my dad, yeah, we'd like to come outside. And me and my brother were like, yeah, you know, we really need to go outside. And my dad turned to his best friend and was like, I need 5 minutes. And then his friend said, you really have to come outside right now. And he and my mom got up and walked out, and my brother and I thought, God is good. One of our first, we were young, but there was this sense of God is good. And we watched my parents walk out, and most of their people had gathered in a circle for this Eucharist. But standing in the center of the circle were 2 state troopers. And as my parents walked up, they just took their hats off in the most like dignified, I mean the boots and everything. And they told them that my sister had died the night before in a drunk driving accident, where she was of course the drunk driver. The miracle was that she never drove alone, but she was driving alone. So it was just her. And my parents' reaction was what you can imagine. I think one of them collapsed. But this vision that has animated my life and my research now, that when they collapsed, they did it into this lay community of followers of Jesus who had taken a weekend to go away from whatever it is keeps you from God. They trusted them, they built relationship with them, and that group literally caught them so that they didn't fall. And the priest was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, which at that time, I have to tell you, was almost illegal in the church. What we used to say is that if you ever don't wear black, you'll never wear pink. You have no future in the church as a priest if you wear common clothes when I was a child. But this was the group of people that not only kept them from literally falling over that day, but kept them for years. This outside the norm ministry that didn't have a building or a vestry or capital campaigns in the same way. And I have never forgotten and know that one of the reasons I have any kind of a spiritual life is because my parents' friends kept praying with them, and it took them years to heal. My father never did, actually. He died when I was 18. To be honest, he died that day in some ways, the way a Marine would, who couldn't keep his own daughter alive. So that Marine couldn't live through this. And it took him 10 years of decay and for him to die. But my mother had the resurrection, but she had it because there were people who continued to believe that baptism is enough. It's so many other things, but it's also enough to bless and to heal and to teach and to learn and to pray and to forgive and to build the church. To build the church. So I have such a formal training for such traditional versions of Christianity, but I know for a fact that the only reason faith stayed alive in my family and therefore in my life was because of a ministry just like yours. Bricks and mortar didn't save my parents' faith. In fact, they hated it. It took them a long time to go back to church. It didn't take them a long time to come back to God, because they found God in these other experiences of people who believe that they can read the Bible, that they can hear the story of Jesus, they can experience transformation, and they can share the story, where they can be a friend. They can make a friend. And they can lead a friend to Jesus. Marriage Encounter believes that. You believe that. And like Mark Twain and I would just say, I know you can do it because I've seen it. So, the things that we're going to talk about, there's so much. I spent the last few months really studying your movement and its history and, doing the head thing. And there's so much to say. And I'm so glad that we have eternity to meditate on the transformations you've had. But the things that I wanted us to think about, we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about what I would call the spiritual sort of state, what we know from research, the spiritual state of the culture. Like, what's the culture in which you're trying to function as a ministry? You have a story, you have a testimony, you have a relationship with Christ, but what's going on around us and why this is important? Remember the miracle of Pentecost. So remember, you have this group of people who speak one or two languages, but remember on that day, there were 3,000 people who were being baptized at the end of that day. So there were a lot of people that were listening to the followers of Jesus speak. And remember the miracle, right, is that each person heard the story of Jesus in their own language. Remember how important that is. And this is the charism of Curcio. If you haven't thought about it before, I hope today to give you a lot of boosting up that some of the things that you're like, oh, we just do that. Well, that's a thing that you're doing. And I hope I can help you understand a little bit psychologically and spiritually and theologically why it's working. I could stop talking and leave and it wouldn't matter because it's working. But if you want to understand sort of maybe how it's working, you know where you might want to try to grow yourself to be more a part of what's working. To understand the culture around you, it's just like Pentecost, that the miracle wasn't that everyone around them could understand Hebrew, right? Because the miracle could have been that. When you think about it, right? What difference does it make? But that's not the miracle, and I think the Holy Spirit is teaching us something. It wasn't that, as long as you talk about Jesus, the Holy Spirit will make everyone understand you. Remember what happened then was as soon as they started talking, the Holy Spirit gave the talkers the ability to know other people's languages. Sometimes we live as a church as if the miracle had gone the other way. Those are churches who are like, people just don't appreciate liturgy. People just, I don't know why they won't get up at 10 in the morning. They should. You don't move your service. You just try to convince people that they're wrong about sleeping at 10 or working. That sounds like someone to me who believes that the miracle God does is helps the world understand the church. That's exhausting. If any of you do that in ministry, trust me, you will burn out. God did not give us a testimony to then help the world understand us. We're given the Holy Spirit who will help us learn the languages of the world around us so that the world can understand us. If you live in a community of people that are all master gardeners, you might want to learn something about gardening if you want to share Jesus with them. If you're in a community that has desperate services for legal aid, and you know something about that, you might want to read up on legal aid and how it's offered if you want to tell them about Jesus. That means you really read the story of Pentecost. So that's what we have to know what's happening in the world. What wounds do people have? What longings do they have? Because it's into that language that we're going to communicate what happened to you on a weekend or what happens to you by being a part of this movement. The second thing that we'll touch on this morning and this afternoon is to be very specific about the challenges that people are facing, but how do we respond, especially when we're sharing those challenges of health and finances and the political meltdown in this country. So how do we do that with joy? With joy. And then, since evangelism is one of your 3 charisms, I mean, what are the goals of evangelism? We all know bad versions of evangelism. I mean, pick a century, pick a decade, pick a day. So what would it look like to use that word proudly and have a theology that makes sense to you? And I can help you with that. Like some of 2 of my dearest friends are both Jewish. And the joke when we're with some of their other Jewish friends, they're like, oh, this is Tricia, she teaches evangelism. There's usually the other Jews at the Seder or the synagogue are like, and you brought her in here? And they're like, yeah, and she loves her job, she's good at it. And again, the nervousness and the rabbi like, how good at it? But before we're done by this afternoon, I'm going to give you some language from the Episcopal tradition of exactly why I love being with my Jewish friend, why I am absolutely an evangelist for the theology of the Episcopal Church, and why both of us sleep well at night. We're not conflicted. We don't just say, well, we're not going to talk about that, or I don't know how that works out, God will work it out. No. There's some very clear, joyful, hopeful, post-colonial answers to how we love people who are Hindu or atheist or Jewish, and how we share our faith. Stay tuned. And lastly, what are the actions and habits of evangelism that share the abundant life of Jesus? Again, here we're going to be talking about the gifts of this particular community and your habits, and how, once informed by understandings of evangelism and of transformation, how do people grow in their faith? I really hope, again, that when you leave here, your experience will be that you understand more fully what's happening to people when they have a religious experience with Christ. And what areas of your life you're ready to grow. And a lot of you may say, like, well, I'm in, I've had my experience, I'm a leader. You know, God has so much more for you ahead of you than behind you. Jesus said we can move mountains. I'm not one who reads that as a metaphor. I just don't. There are great metaphors in Scripture, by the way. To me, that's not a metaphor. That's an invitation to say, it is possible a day from now, a year from now, you will hope deeper than you do now. You will pray more deeply and intimately with God than you do now. It doesn't matter if you're 89 or 92 or 15. More, always more. God has more for us. So as you understand more what you're, and then we'll talk this afternoon about specific experiences you'll be sharing at your table that you've had with Curcio, and we'll look at those experiences and see what does it look like in a faith development for you to grow in that experience. So don't just say, this is my favorite thing or the most powerful. Imagine if that's only a fraction of the power from that practice. How do you go deeper in that? We are meeting here until 10:45, I think is our...
Yep.
So we'll stand up and have a stretch break in a minute. I just wanted to begin. Did any of you have any idea what story I'm playing with here? Lion and Witch in the Wardrobe. I'm a big fan of Narnia. I think the movies were good. They were going to make all of them, but the Harry Potter movies were coming out at the same time. Frankly, there's a lot of the funding. So they did about 3 of them, I think, and then they didn't do the others. They're on the shelf, so we'll see. But that was not an easy. And then a lot of the comic movies started coming out in the early 2000s. But the movies I thought were very good. So this is a picture, of course, Lucy about to enter Narnia for the first time. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. If you don't know it, start on Sunday, go read it. The first one, it's not long. But let's skip to the ending. They enter Narnia, right, and they find that there's a problem in Narnia, right? There's this evil queen who has taken over for a 100-year reign, and Narnia is frozen ice. And remember, it's always winter, never Christmas. I sort of feel like that's the description of capitalism in many ways. All the things we're buying for, all the joy we're waiting for, kind of never comes because everything we buy is at the expense of someone else, not just you. Right? We have it's hard to live a faithful life with gladness and singleness of heart. To not think about our impact on others, on other countries, on the environment, just living the lives we're living. It's a lot of weight on the soul. But when you go into Narnia, there really is one problem, right? It's the witch. There's one problem. And they set out with Aslan, to solve it, and at the end, they become kings and queens of Narnia. Now, what you might find interesting is, and my wife was raised, she grew up until college in London, mostly. So she's American, born in California, but was raised in London. So she was one of the people who actually knows how monarchy works, and always found it interesting that how can you have kings and queens? But remember, for Lewis, coronation was a metaphor for baptism. So what it means is all the daughters of Eve and sons of Adam, all people are kings and queens. And he leaks it in here in a way that the American audience might not have understood, but even the British audience would be like, what is he saying? How can you have more than one queen? So this is all of us. And then the movie ends. And I'm not showing this to you to say this is going to explain the spiritual state of the world we're in right now. I'm actually showing it to you because I'm trying to show you what the spiritual state of the world in America right now is not. We do not have one problem. We do not have one bad guy or bad girl that if we could just overthrow them, it would be spring in America. So this is a great story about resurrection, but it frankly is not really the story about what's happening right now. Who are the enemies? Gosh, who are the friends? I mean, it's not so black and white. If you have read through the series, the 3rd book, or I should say Prince Caspian. Any of you read Prince Caspian? It's one of the, okay, not many, don't worry, don't worry. In Prince Caspian, in a later book, remember they're in Narnia for 18 years, but then they go on a horseback ride or whatever, and they wind up going through the wardrobe, and they come back to London. And I should say they're mad, because they come back to London, they're kids again. And when you've been a monarch for 18 years, you've met God, you've lived in this healed kingdom where evil has been almost permanently eradicated, and now you're back in 10th grade. So the movie and the book begins that they're kind of grumpy, and then they wind up whisked back into Narnia, and they're so glad to go back to the castle on the hill that's supposed to be sort of the kingdom of God. But this is what happens when they arrive back in Narnia. And they walk around and they say, and we lived here for 18 years, and they ask each other, did you ever know any ruins in Narnia? Any site like this? And they just can't figure out, and they're standing, there's this beautiful scene, in the book it doesn't say this, but in the movie they do a very good job. All of a sudden where they're standing, they realize they're standing exactly on this site. This is the great castle, destroyed. Those were where their thrones were, and they're gone. And as they ask around, the book unfolds, 900 years has passed in Narnia since they were there. And over that 900 years, Narnia is taken over by corruption, war, oppression, racism, sexism, violence, lack of belief. Prince Caspian is the story for us now, not the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is the institutional church. We have bishops meeting right now. Bishops, their periodic meetings, all the bishops are meeting to discuss the violations of law of bishops whose cases have been pushed aside so that they could retire. That's why the Title IV discussions are going on right now. That's what our leaders, in the face of all that the world is suffering, I'm not saying they shouldn't be having the conversation, my God, they should be. But literally, they're not even talking about the discipline of priests. They're talking about the complete failure that over 30 or 40 Title IVs are brought against bishops every year, and we haven't disciplined more than one bishop in 15 years. That's a good run, and makes no sense. 30 or 40 people a year are just wrong in but we've had a lot of retirements in each of those cases. So this is the actual leadership in some ways, or at least the faith in the leadership. How about the economy? All the strikes that are going on right now. Mary Barra, who is one of the best CEOs in the country, she's the GM, she makes $35 million a year. And the workers striking against her haven't had a wage increase. They're making less than they were in 1970 as a portion of income. Now, I'm not being political. I'm literally just explaining this. It's not working. The middle class life is not working. The average person who went to college has $67,000 in undergraduate debt right now. If you went to graduate school, you have $181,000. That's an average. A good friend just put his son in Boston College last month. The tuition at Boston College is now over $70,000 a year. A year. That's $35,000 for the first semester. Economic insecurity, personal debt. This is where we are. And what happens in Prince Caspian is eventually Peter decides that Aslan, he believes in Aslan, right? The lion, the Christ figure, but they keep running around trying to deal with all this corruption and gather their own troops, and they just can't find Aslan. Where is he? Because they're like, we knew what he did last time, but where is he? And maybe some of you feel that way. Maybe this morning in the first announcement we had. Where's Aslan? And Peter says in the books and the movie, to me, one of the most honest and sad statements. Now remember, he's the figure of Peter, the rock of the church. Notice how he doesn't say, I don't believe in Aslan, right? What he's kind of saying is, you know what, I think I figured it out. You have experiences with Aslan, you make your Cursillo, and then it's on you. And then it's on you. Don't wait around for Jesus. He came. Be grateful. Now pick up a weapon and fight. I think that's probably what Aslan wants us to do. He showed us, it was like Simon Says, he did it, we had a... But we're not going to wait for him. There's an army out there. We're outnumbered 20-1. So I think we've waited for his actual presence long enough. Let's fight. Let's fight for him. We're not fighting with him. Let's fight for him. Those of you that know the story know, of course, it's Lucy, the youngest child, who continues to be who she is and say, well, we really haven't been looking for Aslan. We've been moving around ourselves. Why don't we go look for Aslan where we met him before? In the woods. Of course, Peter's like, you know, we are right now in a bunker. We literally have got 50 soldiers. There are 10,000 outside. You want to go into the woods and look for Aslan? That's your answer? And she said, well, Peter, don't you remember who defeated the White Witch in the first place? But he still is too much of a leader and says, okay, you go find Aslan and we're going to fight. Let us know how that goes. Which is what anxious leaders do. They do what they know how to do. If you have a weapon on your side, you probably think that's your skill. Right? So we have to be very careful. He's not a bad person. What he's just saying is, I'm a leader. I have to solve a problem. And this waiting, good, cheap, fast. This waiting for Christ looks to me unwise. And so the wisdom of the world is taken over. So he does. He goes and he joins the battle, and Lucy walks back into the woods, and there's Aslan. Now remember what Lewis means. Go back to where we found him. He means the sacramental life. He means living into your testimonies. Where did you meet Christ? Well, in this Lectio Divina. Go do it. So she returns to the tradition, think of that, of Christianity. What are the practices? That's what this is meant to symbolize. I'm going to go find Aslan where I found him before and trust that he will meet me there. And he's literally waiting for her. And she shows up and says something wonderful. Aslan! And you can hear the battle, by the way. Where have you been? And what does Aslan say?
Right here. Right here.
Where have you been?
Of course.
St. Paul says it too, you know. Cease your striving. You know, we're running and running and running. And if we have a weapon, we think that's what we're supposed to use. If you have a hammer, everything is a nail. You've heard that phrase? We stick to what we know when we're afraid. And this idea of waiting on God. Again, that's not inaction. Lucy moved. She went. This has nothing to do with saying, I'm just going to sit here and be a victim of violence. She's going to say, I am going to engage the practices of being in the presence of Aslan, and I believe he will meet me where he's met me before. And of course, she's right. And then he reminds her, you're the one that ran around like a chicken without a head. I'm where I've always been. In other words, I promise I would be with you always, even to the close of the age, and the gates of hell would not ravage against our relationship. That's where I've been. You've been lost in anxiety. Understandably, he doesn't shame her. Have you ever seen those bumper stickers now that are like, if you're not anxious, you're not paying attention? You know, there's some truth to that. So then they go together, and she gets on his back, and he runs to the battlefield where Peter is losing. It's just like a slaughter. And Aslan roars. And this incredible thing happens that it's hard for me to get a picture of the screen. So you have like a handful of the good guys, Narnia people, and all of a sudden when Aslan roars, all of the trees, remember this in the book, uproot and go right toward the enemy. And with their roots and branches, crush the catapults, crush the cannons. And there's this great scene of Peter just kind of looking like, I forgot about the tree. Because he only counted people. We might be tempted to say let's say there's 60 of us in this room. If you say to me truly that there are 60 souls in this room, then I would ask you to come to a class next week at the seminar. The communion of saints is real. This is a crowded room. This is a crowded church. And it is a crowded creation. But when we're anxious, we look for just the concrete that we can see. And meanwhile, Aslan in one roar shows Peter, all creation, I am the Lord not only of all, I'm the Lord of the dance, I am the Lord of all life, the Holy Spirit from the Creed, the Lord, the giver of life. Do you need help? I will command all creation to serve the good. And Peter was like, well, I have 4 people over here, and I've got 3 over here. He just did the wrong math. So I believe that this is kind of a story to help us understand where people are right now spiritually. Corruption in every form, personal, familial, financial, political, it's oppressive on us. And we're realizing that confession that we said last night, the evil done on our behalf, that there are things being done to people, to women and children and orphans and strangers all over the world just for choices we're actually making. We may not even know. The United States is the only industrial nation whose life expectancy is going down. And it has been for the last 10 years. We are the wealthiest nation on earth, and we're also the only modern industrial nation whose life expectancy is going down. The way we are living and loving or not, and believing or not, is literally killing us. This isn't supposed to be like a downer. I'm actually kind of a joy fanatic. But I believe in the miracle of Pentecost. And the more fluent we are in the experiences and the realities around us, the more when Christ sends us out, we can speak those languages. We can speak the gospel and our testimonies into those areas of darkness. We're going to make a turn here, having talked a little bit about kind of the landscape of where any of your weekends are going to happen, and more importantly, on the fourth day, how the world in which people go out and live. I want to consider what the specific longings are, because this afternoon we're going to be kind of breaking down your rule of life and your habits in Curcio, and hopefully they'll match different longings we look at this morning. And you might be reinvigorated with how the content of this particular movement, the things God has called you to do and to pray and to say. I hope you leave here with more of a sense that you put together some puzzle pieces with like just some secular data or other realities, and you begin to say, my gosh, that third pillar of our rule of life literally addresses something on the news last night, almost like one-to-one. So today is the day to make those kind of connections, to put together these incredible puzzle pieces you have of your language and your practice in Curcio, and things that are happening in the world and in the church. But what I want to do right now, it is 10:19. So why don't we just take like we'll start again at 10:25, just 6 minutes. Stand up. If you do need to use a restroom, it's right out there to the right. I'll start in 6 or 7 minutes, even if you're not back yet, but some of you, and then we just go a few more minutes after that, and then you'll have another break, but it's been a long time since. Okay, we're just going to say a few more things about the world, and again, I'm hoping that we'll be more explicit this afternoon, but you'll be thinking about your Curcio experiences, your Curcio values, the things that have become part of your daily life, and see what those transformative testimonies might speak into this world that we're in. I want to sort of give you a little bit of an entertaining view. How many of you watched Cheers back when it was on? Yeah. A lot of my students now were not alive. I mean, I was young, it was past my bedtime, but at least I was alive. This show is hard to calculate how popular it is now because, you know, viewerships are so different now. But at the time, its final episode really was the most watched television episode. 2 months later, MASH. But it's in that area, right? 28 Emmy Awards. Do any of you not know what Cheers is? Oh, you don't have to read it, that's embarrassing. Don't, raise your hand. It was a pilot they didn't think would work because the whole show only takes place in one room. It's a one-room show for all those years. And the only way you know about anyone is they come into the one-room bar and tell you about their day. But think about that. There's no sets. Everything you knew about these people, you only knew through their telling you. So the whole story is about testimonies, right? It's so intimate, and yet think of it. All those years, 10 years, and they only have one set. So keep in mind what we're talking, right? So that's like 1993, early 1990s. The book, Cheers was so popular that sociologists and anthropologists started to study. Why did people love it? MASH was like a dramatic story about a war. There were all different sets, right? all these moving parts. How was this other show so popular with such simple elements? So one of the best books of the time was written, I don't know if you can see the subtitle here, Cafes, Coffee Shops, Community Centers. Now look what year we are, 1989. So Cheers is very popular, but isn't even over yet. General stores, bars, hangouts, and how they get you through the day. So this was the first time that, and also people studying religion and faith in America, started to say that Cheers is telling us something. And what gets invented in his book is this phrase called the third space. I wonder if any of you have heard that, if sociologists use it, Starbucks and things like that use it. And the theory was that humans are happiest when they learn to live healthfully in 3 areas: home, work, and they have a third space where they are known. Everyone knows your name. So the Cheers bar was everyone's third. So the mailman, he had work, and they all had home, some kind of family or whatever. But that was what people loved about Cheers, and that's the great longing of people, why they said in the 80s and 90s, we start opening up so many cafes, not fancy restaurants, but places you can come and hang out and process those other 2 areas of your life. Less expectations, right, than work at home. Maybe less sin than work at home, or guilt than work at home. But the third space is somewhere you develop loyalty, you have freedom to express yourself in ways maybe you can't at work and at home. Now, this is kind of a dated theory, right? Because the problem now in America, what is home, work? There's so many, home isn't necessarily a family. Only 1/3 of American households have children in the house. So this whole notion of home as being some intergenerational space is not necessarily the norm. So you have to kind of update some of these terms, but I'm walking through this history for a reason. But there was this understanding here that we needed somewhere besides the responsibilities and the love and the busyness of family, and somewhere besides work to be fully human. A third space is a non-competitive space, unless you're playing like a game. It's a non-competitive space. And remember, living in a capitalist free market economy means your home is a competitive space. You may not think of it as a competitive space, but both your work and your home is trying to stay up, not with the Joneses, but with your own bills. So there was this moment where people started to say, well, maybe is church the third space? Maybe that's what church can be. A third space, a non-competitive relational space where everyone knows you and you can process your home and work life. People thought that for a while. And then some churches went further and put cafes, the mega big box churches, and coffee shops in their churches so that they could have a third space in their church. Then an essay comes out in 1995 that becomes a book. Have any of you ever heard the book Bowling Alone? No. And can you believe how many decades it's been? This was a huge bestseller, secular book. And it was Robert Putnam is just a famous sociologist of American culture. He's very interested in religion. I think he's either Methodist. He's a mainline Protestant person, so that's not his primary interest. But he says a lot about religion that makes a lot of sense. And he's been writing that for 40 years. But he noticed that one of the reasons people loved Cheers so much is because already in the 90s they did not have time and energy for a third space. So people watched Cheers because it was like their longing, not their reality. The economy under Reagan, the role of the stock market in people's lives, the kind of peace economy after the Vietnam War, it was this incredible, and then the development of the internet in the early 2000s, that what was happening is bowling alleys were closing, the Elks clubs were closing. People didn't have time for weekly gatherings of a few hours that was neither work or family. So he wrote this famous book called Bowling Alone, and it was about just the decline of third spaces in American culture. Because family and the rate of divorce and things like that was just becoming so much larger, and work was becoming so much larger because of the proliferation of credit cards from the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. People are incredible amounts of debt, and what's being squished out is their ability to have third spaces. And then in more rural, poorer communities that really value third spaces, they were taking on second jobs. So the rich don't have time for third spaces, you know what I mean? And the poor, because of the flattening of wages for decades, they don't actually have time. They don't have 4 hours on Thursday night to go bowling either. And by the way, a bowling ball costs twice as what it did 10 years ago, and they're making $6 less an hour at the factory than they were making 10 years ago. So everyone was crushed. So now there's just so few people who value gathering in community, going on a Curcio weekend, that his famous book, Bowling Alone, that he had some suggestions in there to solve this problem, but they were never realized. In 2012, we're almost done with this history. You'll see in a minute why this is a spiritual story more than anything. Really, the preeminent economist and philosopher in this country at Harvard, Michael Sandel, wrote this amazing book, What Money Can't Buy. You have to understand, this was a shock. Michael Sandel is a genius, maybe a 50 or 100-year genius on what money does. But he decided to write this book. And with all of his studies of economics, he basically said, Americans actually don't want money. They want things that they don't have and can't have, so they look for money instead. And he leans heavy into philosophy and introduces my favorite made-up word ever. Maybe not ever. It's up there. He talks about the pain that Americans are in. Because what they really want isn't money. And money is harder and harder to get, and everyone still thinks money might be what they want. So you see how awful it is? Even if you get the money, you then realize the money isn't the answer. And most people, he says, now can't even get the money. And we are bowling alone. We have less community engagement. There's not a lot of time for the PTA or anything. And the average kid now is trying to get into college with sports and music, and because college is too expensive. So all of a sudden your kid is 10 years old, and they're going to all these camps and enrichment because if they can professionalize their lives by high school, they can be recruited, and maybe they can go to college for less money or for free. And he said, you know what the real problem is? Skyboxification. And what he means by skyboxification is, and I experienced this, about 10 years ago, they opened up the new Nationals baseball stadium here in DC. Maybe it's 12 years. And we're like fair weather baseball fans. I mean, I lived up in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 10 years, so I was a Red Sox fan and rock on. Sorry about the season. But on the other hand, when I moved here, Nationals, you know what I mean? Like, I'm kind of fair weather. I just, cheer. I like the food. And in DC, there's always like a gluten-free cupcake stand. I'm like, I love DC. But someone gave us tickets once. One of the churches I served was on Capitol Hill. So the Capitol was in my parish. So I was one of those people that prays the opening prayer in Congress. It's funny, the last time I did it, the speaker, you know how the speaker rotates? Every day there's a speaker up there, but it's a different person. So actually the last day I prayed, it was Mark Meadows, the representative back then from South Carolina behind me, who then went on to other things. But one of my famous people in my parish gave us 2 tickets to the baseball stadium when it kind of first opened. But they gave me like a envelope at church. It was kind of thick. And there was a special parking pass in it. There was like a special ID. It was just complicated. It was a bunch of things. So as we're driving to the game, we were late because it was Sunday and we both had done church. So we had one of those Easy Pass things. So we pulled into the fast lane as we're driving because we thought we didn't pay for the game, but we paid like $9 to go from here, and to the stadium is, by the way, 6.3 miles. So we paid $9 to be on the fast lane. But then when we got there, we saw all of our tickets. There were signs about our parking. Special signs. So as soon as we came out of the fast lane, we then got brought to our parking lot, which is right next to the stadium. We were then directed to our elevator. There's an entrance to the park for just the people who parked in VIP parking. And when the elevator opened, there was someone operating it. Like, we didn't have to push the buttons. And then when we went up to the skybox and we came out, it turns out there's all the concession stands that were all down there are all private in this area. So we had our own concession stands. And the bathrooms were like crazy. Granite. And then we walked out to our perch and looked at the masses. So we sit down and we're trying to figure out if I want a pretzel, and then a waitress comes to our aisle. You don't even walk over. She goes to the private concession area. So I was like, are you kidding me? She's like, what do you want to eat? I was like, oh my gosh. She shows me a menu. Skyboxification, why he's concerned is think baseball in 1950, 1920, and 1980. It was one of the places you'd mix with people of other social classes. And of course, there was always the expensive seats. Does that make sense? But you came in the same entrance to the park. And the people who got there early parked close, and the people that got there late parked far away. It kind of didn't matter how much money you had. But going on if you fly airlines, like I have to do a lot of traveling, so I sit there, you know this, when they do the boarding, gold members, silver members, platinum members, sapphire members, emerald members, thank you for coming, you can load. And you get, it's like a whole color palette. And if you're just a person who bought a ticket, you will wait 20 minutes for every color. There's like animals, zebras, cubs, snakes. I mean, it just goes on and on, because the more money you have, you don't have to wait in line. But it's buying us out of communities of diverse life experiences. Lisa and I left our house. We didn't even drive in the same traffic. Our skyboxification, right? Our privatizing our experience away from our neighbors began at our door. We got on 395, that's a mile away from here. And as soon as we got on, we were on a road only with cars like ours. And I didn't use a bathroom with a working class person. I didn't even have to walk to the concession stand where I'd be waited on, probably by a middle class person or a working class person. The only people I actually were with was the person I came with and other people who came the same way we did. Our own entrance, our own elevator. Stunning. And what Michael Sandel says, this is going to destroy America. Don't worry about an economic collapse. We have the ability to skyboxify our lives, and every class has that ability. How I lost it, I was a chaplain at a high school, and I could just be honest, normally I have to be out of state to make these criticisms. Let's just say locally, I was working at Episcopal school. You know, who 15 years ago, it's a day school, so it's not the Episcopal High School, which is next to us, that's a boarding school. There are 4 other Episcopal schools in Alexandria that are day schools. So I was a chaplain of day school, and it was $40,000 a year, kindergarten to 12th grade, when I was there. Now it's 58 or something. Episcopal High School here is 79, but at least that's boarding. So that's the market of Episcopalians right here. So we had a silent auction. You could auction off things. And I just lost my mind. I was supposed to say the opening prayer at the silent auction. And as I walked around, I should have never done that. I walked around and looked at the things that people were, it's all a game. I mean, everyone just walks in and gives them $50,000. So they don't even want the trip they bought. Does that make sense? Everyone just knows when they come how much money they're going to give. So they just kind of, it's just an incredible scene of wealth. I walked into the temple on Tuesday of Holy Week. But one of the things was they painted a fast lane at the drop-off at the elementary school, which is a long line, do you know what I mean? And they were auctioning off. They created a fast, and it was $10,000. And I thought, what is the spiritual impact that when all these other kids who are all wealthy enough, or at least savvy enough to get scholarships to pay the $40,000 a year. And while they're waiting, their best friend drives in the yellow lane because their family paid another $10,000. They don't even have to wait in traffic to go to elementary school. What's the spiritual life of that kid who gets out and looks at all their friends who are all wealthy Even if they're poor, kids joke like, we're on scholarship. I'm like, you're still in the 5%. You may not be the 1%, but you have 2 siblings in this school, all paying that. The average family had 2.1 kids in that school, so they were paying that tuition twice from kindergarten until 12th grade. But even in that community, they skyboxified and created, and by the way, I hear now it's $20,000. And they sell like 5 of them so that there's never traffic. Even in elementary school, we find a way to separate ourselves. Again, we're going to be meditating this afternoon on the practices and pillars of Curcio in different ways. I'm hoping to give you a revival for the beauty of your movement. Because you exist in a world where that fast pass exists. The mom, dad, grandparent, aunt who's driving in that car could come on a weekend with you. Who is running out of things to say to the 6-year-old that says, why can't my best friend's mom be in this lane too? Why am I at school 10 minutes earlier than everyone else? I'm lonely. I have to wait for the rest of my friends? Why are they in traffic and we not? That woman, that man, that babysitter could walk in to do a weekend with you. Not from a world of murder and theft, do you know what I mean? But a world of skyboxification and loneliness and competition. And what does the sweet sound of the Lord's presence do to someone like that? I've been trying to paint for you a shape of the thirst of the country for what you do. And maybe help you understand why even in your lives it was so powerful and you haven't thought of it. What was making me thirsty? That Curcio quenched a lot of my thirst. And it was really God, right? But this is the way in which you've experienced the quenching of your thirst. This is an incredible statue. It's right now in Geneva. The name of the statue is called Melancholy. But I put a picture next to it. This is a statue around Minneapolis to make a point before we now break for your workshop. It's a pretty empty image on the left, like literally the definition of emptiness. But the statue on the right is also completely empty. It's also a wrought iron copper mixed statue, right? There's nothing inside it. It's full not in itself. It's full because of the light coming through it. Capitalism says the problem with the left side is we just have to fill the hole. Fill the hole. But what life and faith is don't fill the hole. Fill the life with the Holy Spirit. And all of a sudden you want more space in you. Isn't that interesting? Like you want space more than the person on the left. John the Baptist says, I want to become less so Christ becomes more. And that doesn't mean he doesn't matter. Remember C.S. Lewis has that great phrase about humility? Humility isn't caring less about yourself. Do you know how it ends? Humility is caring about yourself less. In other words, the more you think about yourself, the more you think it's your job to fill that with a different job, a different partner, a different city. And the truth is we are called to be fully open that God would fill us. This is the woman that went to the well. This is like someone saying to this woman at the well, just drink more soda or wine. And this is the woman at the well who meets Jesus, who says, I will give you water that will not make you thirsty. It will quench your thirst forever. In fact, it will well up with you to eternal life. Let me put in you that which will overflow. You don't have to fill your hole. So this is American culture in so many ways. And this is the opportunity of baptism. I'll leave this up here just so you can see it as you leave and go to your workshops. I don't know if any of you know this came out in May. NPR had a lot of stories about it. This is It's about 80 pages. It's a government report. I mean, part of you are like, are you actually saying we should just read a government report? Is this what it's like to live in the DC area? The nice thing about this report is it was written for Americans. It has huge fonts. It's full of pictures. It's meant to be read by normal people, unlike most government reports. What I just want you to know is this is our Surgeon General, and he became Surgeon General in 2016. On the front page of this report is a personal letter from him explaining why he decided to write a report on the epidemic of loneliness. He said when he became the first Surgeon General, he said, I did not believe loneliness was a root problem in America. You should just know, the reason he says that is there was a movement. Did you know in the UK, there is a minister for loneliness? Now, it's not that they care more about each other than we do. It's that the national healthcare system identified that the health damage of loneliness will bankrupt a national healthcare system. Will bankrupt it. That's why they have a minister for loneliness. And its health effects on children or people of any age. So there's already a movement, does that make sense, afoot that loneliness, so he's admitting, when I became Surgeon General, I wasn't one of the loneliness people. I knew it was a problem, but he was like, it's really heart disease and diabetes, you know. He was like, it's not all about loneliness. I wasn't that guy. He then went on a listening tour because he was one of the first people of color to be a Surgeon General from Southeast Asia. And he said at the end of his listening tour, he said, everywhere I went, it was loneliness. This is our root problem in America. This is why the life expectancy is going down. I'll give you a sheet with some statistics on it before you leave if you're that kind of person and want to see a bunch of them. I took all the statistics out of this report and put them on a page for you, so if you just want to see the damage that loneliness does to a person is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. People who report chronic loneliness are 50% more likely to develop dementia. When you think about dementia will cost the United States, do you see why there's a minister for loneliness? And if you could address even a percentage of the loneliness, you have a 50% higher chance of developing dementia if you report loneliness? What? This study, why it's so powerful, it's not a study. They took 118 studies on loneliness in the last 20 years and then added research to it. So this is almost like a summary of what we know about loneliness across the country. Race, class, gender, education level, national origin, all of it. In all pretty colored pictures. Making the same point. Our country is more, that's why I started with Cheers and Bowling Alone and skyboxification. Our country right now is literally dying, not from illnesses. We have illnesses on a large part because of the way we're living. Competitive, fearful, faithless, and that's not a judgment. Don't know what to have faith in. Remember Narnia in ruins? Organized religion strikes people as an invitation to insincerity, inauthentic living, power plays, name dropping. This is the majority of our country. More than 50% of our country say that they either don't believe in God or they have no interest in engaging religious community. Half the country. And they're beset by a loneliness epidemic. So as you go off to your workshops, know that this afternoon when we get back together, what we're going to be talking about is, if we believe in the Pentecost miracle, how do we communicate your testimonies and your gifts in Curcio into this language of our culture right now? Have you ever thought about talking about your relationship with Christ and what it's done to help you deal with loneliness? When we know so many people in America are literally dying from it. How do we break out of some of the words and the phrases of the kinds of Christianity we practice so that these people can hear the gospel in their language? Isolation, skyboxification, which is almost a funny word, but you all know that experience. If you bought a business class seat, or you pay $100 so that you can actually carry 2 bags. By the way, LASIK surgery, people believe it. there's some of you who can't have LASIK, but there are a few people now that are pretty convinced that in the next 10 years, anyone who has glasses, you'll know they're poor. Because it's a visual to your healthcare ability to spend. I know myself, I have a terrible, I have Crohn's disease. I've had all my colon removed, I have an ostomy bag. I try to normalize that for young people. I've had a terrible 10 or 15 years with Crohn's disease. So I get infusions regularly, that's what keeps me alive. I can't tell you how much of my treatments I pay for myself. And it breaks my heart to know that so much of my pain medication has never been covered. But I'm a middle-class Episcopalian, do you know what I mean? I don't have children, I make a nice salary. Whatever's not covered, I just pay for. But when I think of other people, even who have insurance, who can't top it off like I can, you know? I know the pain that they have, because I would have it if I didn't have disposable income. Forget the uninsured, who would probably just die. I mean, I was told when I first got Crohn's that the death rate is 10, 18% or something, and I thought, oh my God. And then my doctor leaned over and said, your insurance does, don't worry about those numbers. That's just the number of people who are not insured. You won't die from it. And the doctor walked out, and I saw over the years I've had Crohn's that the death rate is now up to 20% from Crohn's, but it's not people like me. That's just the uninsured. So it's hard to hear all these things. A lot of you know these things, but it helps me when I communicate to people in waiting rooms, because I'm in infusion centers all the time, and always will be, that I speak in those terms of fear and scarcity and debt. When I talk to young adults, I'm always talking about debt, student debt, personal debt, credit cards. You think I'm obsessed with it, I'm an economist or something. I'm just obeying Pentecost. So the invitation this afternoon will be, what do you know about your actual community? What are the struggles, the longings, the pain of your community? And what would it mean to testify in those terms, and not just the terms of your spiritual life? Okay, we've got a few minutes over. Your workshops are listed there. I'm sure one of the posts can orient you to how you get to them, and then to lunch, and then we'll meet back in here with me after lunch.